The Woolworths sit-ins, also known as the Greensboro sit-ins, were the first in a long series of nonviolent events that would change the United States as people knew it. At 4:30 p.m. February 1st in 1960, four college students from a local university, Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., and David Richmond, sat down at Woolworths in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina. The four were protesting the segregated lunch counters. They wanted to challenge the hypocrisy of a store that would accept their money in the checkout line, but not at the lunch counter. The four sat down at the whites-only section, and jaws dropped everywhere in the store. Ezell Blair asked for a cup of coffee, to which the waitress replied that she didn't serve people of their kind here. This was what they expected, but they didn't give up. They stayed at the lunch counter, continuing their peaceful protest. Joseph McNeil expressed in a later interview that he expected to be beaten or arrested that day. A police officer did show up, and he started pacing back and forth. Franklin McCain thought to himself, "We got him." The police officer didn't know what to do. The four, who are now known as the Greensboro Four, went in with high hopes, but what they didn't know is that a revolution was coming. Preceding these events is a history of racial segregation, violence, and discrimination. Even after President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which granted freedom to most slaves, racial tension did not decrease in the South. With the famous Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896, courts upheld the law that racial segregation was legal. It was called separate but equal, and supporters of this argued that this country was founded on certain ways of life, and if you decided to change it, then it could mean the downfall of the United States. This ideology may seem silly today, but in the South, the majority of whites and even the black community believed this to be true. There were designated black and white areas for almost all social institutions. Schools, churches, restaurants, water fountains, trains, anything you could think of would be separated into white and black categories. The Greensboro Four wanted to change this. Segregation was still occurring even in the South after the Brown versus Board of Education case, which ruled racial segregation to be unconstitutional in 1954. The four would often stay up late in their dorm rooms at A&T University and talk about the many injustices that were occurring. One injustice specifically was the murder of Emmett Till in 1955. Emmett was a 14-year-old African-American teenager who was visiting his family in a small town in Mississippi. He was originally from Chicago, where racial segregation and tension were less prevalent. He was unaware of the harsh social norms in the South. He was seen flirting with a white woman in a local store. This infuriated locals who saw this occurring. The husband and the half-brother of the woman would abduct Emmett from his uncle's house later several nights. They beat up and mutilated his body before throwing it in the Tallahatchie River, and when his body was discovered, it was unrecognizable. Sadly, they were not even charged with his murder, and many white folks in the South supported his murderers. This enraged the nation and caused an uproar among the black community and all others in support of racial desegregation and justice for all. Tens of thousands attended Emmett's funeral, and his murder would not be in vain. The Greensboro Four were intent on changing the United States. A day after their first protests in Woolworths, 27 more men joined them, all dressed in suits and ties, and 4 women also joined them. By day 4, there were hundreds joining them at Woolworths, including some white people in support of desegregation. There were so many in opposition, though. Many young white teens and Ku Klux members would soon make appearances in attempts to stop them. There were many death and bomb threats. But a week after the first day of the sit-ins, more were occurring across the state in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and Durham, North Carolina. And then after that, Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Charlotte soon joined in as well. A month later, the sit-ins spread across the country as far as Texas. The Greensboro Four sparked a flame that would continue for some time. For 6 months, Woolworth's management would not give in to the protests. They continued to support the racial segregation, but on July 25, 1960, the Woolworths main headquarters ordered the store to give in. The whole company was officially desegregated. Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., and David Richmond achieved justice in what seemed to be a hopeless situation, all with their nonviolent sit-ins. Woolworths closed down in the 1990s, but it has since been converted to a civil rights museum which is open to the public. The Greensboro Four used the idea of nonviolence and made it their personal mantras. Though nonviolence is certainly not a new thing, nonviolence has been happening since the times of Plato and Socrates. Gandhi even used nonviolence to gain independence for India. He lived his whole life dedicated to the idea of satyagraha, which is a lifestyle of nonviolence. It directly translates to truth force, and he believed that truth and love were all that you needed to change injustice. He was jailed many times because of his civil disobedience. He helped India achieve independence from Britain in 1947 because of his nonviolent action. The Greensboro Four were heavily influenced by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his nonviolent direct action. He believed that you should peacefully challenge any unjust laws and not be afraid of the consequences. Martin Luther King Jr. was similarly jailed 29 times, but was still not his quest for equality. He sacrificed his life for what he believed. Nonviolence isn't just an idea, it's a way of life. If these historic events teach us anything, it's that change does not need to come through violence. Anything can happen if we peacefully challenge injustice in our society. And I think with all the recent events that have occurred in the United States, we need nonviolent action now more than ever. And who knows, there could be another set of 4 college students getting ready to change the world.